In the quiet corners of American history, where the official records fall silent, some stories fester. They are tales of a darkness that hides not in the shadows of the forest, but in the familiar glow of the hearth, in the intimacy of a home. This is one such case. It concerns a family, a child, and a simple glass of milk, an act of care, an offering of nourishment, that became a vessel for a sorrow so profound it could only express itself as poison. The sweetness was a lie, a carefully measured deception to conceal a sickness that had nothing to do with fever, and everything to do with a justice that was as slow and quiet and inevitable as death itself. If the archives of the forgotten call to you, and you find yourself here for the first time among these records, consider subscribing. Join us in the quiet work of turning the page on histories that were meant to be erased. To understand the events that unfolded in the McCready cabin during the late summer of 1870, one must first understand the land itself. Cades Cove was not merely a location, it was a condition. A sprawling, verdant bowl carved into the flesh of the Great Smoky Mountains, its beauty was a form of imprisonment. The mountains rose on all sides, ancient and indifferent, their peaks wreathed in a perpetual blue haze that seemed to lock the valley in a state of tranquil isolation. They were walls, not vistas. For the families settled there, the world beyond the gap was a distant rumor, a place of wars and politics that reached them only as echoes, months late and already fading into irrelevance. The war between the states had ended 5 years prior, but in the Cove, the conflict had been a far more intimate affair. It was a place of fractured loyalties, where neighbor had harbored suspicion against neighbor, and the scars remained not on the landscape, but etched into the memories of the people. The peace that had settled was sullen and watchful. It was a quiet born, not of harmony, but of shared exhaustion. The air itself seemed heavy with things unsaid, secrets buried in the rich, dark soil alongside the dead. The silence of the Cove was not peaceful. It was a silence that listened. Into this simmering quiet lived the McCready family. Their cabin stood on a modest plot of land cleared by the patriarch's own hands, a testament to the stubborn determination required to carve a life from the unforgiving Appalachian earth. It was a structure of hewn poplar logs, chinked with mud and stone, solid and unadorned. Inside, the air was a permanent mixture of wood smoke, curing bacon, and the faint, clean scent of lye soap. It was a home built for survival, not comfort. The patriarch, Thomas McCready, was a man forged by this landscape. He had returned from the war with a silence that seemed to have taken up permanent residence within him, a stillness in his eyes that had not been there before. He was a man of routines and rituals, his days measured by the sun's arc across the sky and the demands of his small farm. His pride resided in his land, in the straightness of his fences, and the health of his livestock. He was a man who believed in the tangible, in the evidence of his own labor. Anything else, the whispers of superstition, or the complexities of the human heart, he regarded with a deep and abiding suspicion. His wife, the mother, was a woman whose world had contracted to the dimensions of the cabin's 2 small rooms. Her name was Eliza, and she moved through her days with a quiet diligence that mirrored her husband's. Yet where his focus was outward, on the fields and the forest, hers was turned inward, a constant, anxious monitoring of the home's interior climate. Her life had been a series of hardships and small, fleeting joys, but the birth of her son, Samuel, had recalibrated her existence entirely. The infant was the singular focus of her devotion, a fragile vessel into which she poured all of her hopes for a life less grim than her own. She had a small, humanizing habit of tracing the delicate shell of the infant's ear with her finger as he slept, a silent prayer for his protection in a world she knew to be fraught with peril. The child was her anchor, the living, breathing proof that life could persist, even flourish, in this isolated place. The ticking of the simple wooden clock on the mantelpiece was the metronome of her life, each second a small victory against the vast, waiting wilderness outside her door. It was into this carefully ordered, self-contained world that Clara Mayfield arrived. She was not a guest, nor was she, in the legal sense, property. The war had seen to that. She was, instead, a consequence of debt, a human ledger entry passed from one family to another to settle an old account. She was a young woman, barely 16 years of age, whose freedom was a technicality, a word on a piece of paper that had no currency in the remote economy of the Cove. She was bound to the Macreadys for a term of 7 years, a form of indentured servitude that was slavery in all but name. Her arrival was unceremonious. She appeared one afternoon, walking behind the cart of a neighbor from down the valley, carrying a small bundle of possessions that seemed to contain nothing of weight. Her face was a mask of stoic neutrality, her eyes holding a depth that seemed to absorb the light around them without reflecting any of it back. She was introduced to the mother as their new help, a presence meant to ease the burdens of running the household. From the very beginning, Clara moved through the cabin with an unnerving efficiency. She was a phantom of quiet competence, her hands always busy, her footsteps making almost no sound on the rough-hewn floorboards. She learned the rhythms of the household without needing to be told, anticipating the mother's needs before they were spoken. She tended the fire, kneaded the bread, and scrubbed the floors with a tireless, methodical energy that was both a comfort and a source of a subtle, unnameable disquiet for the mother. There was a completeness to her self-containment that felt unnatural. She never spoke unless spoken to, and her replies were brief, direct, and offered no window into her thoughts. The mother attempted small kindnesses, offering her a piece of cornbread or asking after her journey, but these overtures were met with the same placid, unreadable expression. Clara was a presence that could be felt but not known, a still, deep pool of water whose depths were impossible to gauge. She performed her duties flawlessly, yet her very flawlessness was unsettling. It was as if she were an actress playing a part, her movements and words a perfect recitation of a role she had been forced to learn. The first sign that something was amiss was so small, so insignificant, that it was dismissed almost as soon as it was perceived. It began with the infant's milk. The family kept a single Jersey cow, a placid creature whose milk was known for its richness. Each morning and evening, the mother or Clara would milk the cow, strain the warm liquid through a clean piece of muslin, and store it in a cool, dark corner of the cabin. It was a ritual as old as the Cove itself, a cornerstone of their sustenance. But one afternoon, as the mother prepared a bottle for the infant Samuel, she noticed a subtle change. On tasting the milk to test its temperature, a faint, almost imperceptible tang lingered on her tongue. It was not the overt sourness of spoiled milk, but something more nuanced, a slight, clinging bitterness that lay hidden beneath the cream. She frowned, sniffed the bottle, but detected no foul odor. She chalked it up to the oppressive summer heat, or perhaps something the cow had eaten in the pasture. She emptied the bottle, fetched fresh milk, and thought no more of it. Yet, the next day, the same subtle wrongness was there, a ghost of a flavor that hinted at decay. It was a detail so anomalous, so contrary to the established order of things, that her mind refused to grant it significance. Then came the flies, not the usual smattering of insects that buzzed lazily in the summer air, but a different kind of gathering. They appeared first in the nursery, the small alcove where the infant's cradle Saturday. They were large, black-bodied flies, the kind that are drawn to sickness and rot. They moved with a strange lethargy, clustering on the rough wooden walls, and the single small window pane, there buzzing a low, insistent hum that grated on the nerves. The mother found their presence to be a profound violation. She had kept the nursery meticulously clean, the linens always fresh, the air free of any foulness. Yet the flies came. She swatted them with a furious energy, their small bodies leaving dark smudges on the walls. She burned bundles of dried herbs, filling the small space with a pungent, cleansing smoke. She sealed the cracks around the window with strips of cloth, but they always returned. Within hours, a new congregation would assemble, drawn by some invisible, irresistible summons to the space around the cradle. Her husband, the patriarch, dismissed her concerns. He stated that flies were a simple fact of summer, a nuisance to be endured, but the mother knew, with a certainty she could not articulate, that this was different. Their persistence felt malevolent, their presence a silent, buzzing judgment on the sanctity of her home. The infant Samuel, once a placid and healthy baby, grew restless. His sleep became fitful, punctuated by small, sharp cries of distress that seemed to have no discernible cause. He began to refuse the bottle, turning his head away from the nipple, his small face contorting in frustration. The mother would walk the floor with him for hours, the rhythmic creaking of the boards, a mournful accompaniment to his weeping. She tried everything she could think of. She sang him lullabies, she rocked him, she offered him water sweetened with a touch of molasses, but the child's discomfort only deepened. A low-grade fever took hold of his small body, a persistent, clammy heat that clung to his skin. His breathing grew shallow, and a look of weary confusion entered his eyes. Throughout this slow, creeping escalation of wrongness, Clara Mayfield remained a silent observer. She moved through the unfolding domestic crisis with the same unnerving calm she had exhibited since her arrival. It was Clara who often prepared the infant's bottles, her slender hands moving with a practiced, steady grace as she poured the milk and warmed it by the hearth. The mother, consumed by her growing fear, would watch her. She searched Clara's face for any sign of concern, of pity, of shared anxiety. She found nothing. Clara's expression was a placid mask of dutiful servitude. She would hand the warm bottle to the mother and then retreat to the shadows of the cabin, her work done. There was no way to know if she noticed the milk's strange aftertaste, or if she saw the unnatural gathering of flies around the cradle. Her silence was absolute, a vacuum into which the mother's own anxieties rushed and swirled. The question began to form, unbidden and terrifying, in the deepest recesses of the mother's mind. What was this sickness that had invaded her home? Was it a punishment from God, a natural consequence of the harshness of this life, a summer flux that so often claimed the young? Her rational mind clung to these explanations, to the familiar and the known. But as the infant's fever worsened, as his cries grew weaker, a darker suspicion began to take root, a suspicion that pointed not to the heavens or to the earth, but to the quiet, watchful figure who moved so silently within their walls. She looked at the caregiver, and for a fleeting, horrifying moment, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with her child's sickness. But the thought was too monstrous to entertain, and so she pushed it away, turning her attention back to the fever, back to the search for a cure in a world that was steadily, inexorably being poisoned from within. The patriarch's decision to fetch a doctor was an admission of profound failure. In Cades Cove, to seek outside help was to concede that the resources of the land and of one's own hands were insufficient. It was an act of last resort, a journey of desperation across miles of unforgiving terrain. He rode out at dawn, his form a rigid silhouette against the misty, rising Sunday. The path was little more than a suggestion, a rutted track that wound through dense thickets of rhododendron and over streams that ran swift and cold with mountain water. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a primordial perfume that clung to his clothes and filled his lungs. For hours, the only sounds were the rhythmic plodding of his horse's hooves, the creak of saddle leather, and the incessant, high-pitched hum of insects in the humid air. He rode with a singular, grim focus. The image of his ailing son burned into his mind. Each mile he covered was a measure of his helplessness, a physical manifestation of the distance between his child and a cure. He was a man accustomed to wrestling with the tangible world, with stubborn tree stumps and rocky soil. This enemy, this invisible sickness, was a foe he could not see or strike, and the impotence of it settled in his gut like a cold stone. Dr. Ellis Harrow arrived in the late afternoon, his horse lathered with sweat, his face etched with the weariness of the journey. He was a man of science, a graduate of a respectable Philadelphia medical college, a fact that set him apart from the folk healers and midwives of the mountains. He carried a worn leather bag that smelled of carbolic acid and dried herbs, a scent of clinical authority that seemed alien in the rustic confines of the McCready cabin. He was not a large man, but he possessed an air of quiet confidence that commanded respect. His hands were clean, and his movements precise as he stepped into the oppressive heat of the main room. He gave a curt nod to the patriarch and a more sympathetic one to the mother, whose eyes, wide with a mixture of terror and hope, were fixed upon him as if he were a savior. She had spent the day in a state of suspended animation, her entire being focused on the shallow, ragged breaths of the infant in her arms. The air in the cabin was thick and stagnant, heavy with the smell of sickness, sweat, and the faint, sweetish odor of milk that had begun to turn. Candle smoke hung in the air, creating a hazy, claustrophobic atmosphere that seemed to shrink the already small space. The doctor's examination was a methodical ritual performed in near silence. He instructed the mother to lay the infant on the simple wooden table that served as their place for meals. He unwrapped the child's swaddling clothes, his fingers probing the infant's soft belly, his ear pressed against the small, heaving chest. He noted the feverish heat radiating from the skin, the listlessness of the limbs, the glassy, unfocused look in the infant Samuel's eyes. The mother stood a few feet away, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles were white, her lips moving in a silent, frantic prayer. The patriarch stood by the door, his arms crossed, his face a stony mask that betrayed none of the turmoil within. He watched the doctor's every move, his skepticism warring with a desperate need to believe in this man's expertise. After a long, torturous silence, the doctor straightened up, his expression grim but resolute. He informed them that the child was suffering from what was commonly known as the summer flux. He explained that it was a severe intestinal ailment brought on by the oppressive heat and, often, by milk that had soured imperceptibly in the warmth. His words, delivered in a calm, authoritative tone, were both a relief and a death sentence. They gave a name to the terror, grounding it in the known world of natural afflictions. Yet it was a name that carried with it a terrible weight. Every family in the Cove had lost a child to the summer flux. It was a seasonal plague, a grim reaper that stalked the hottest months of the year, preying on the very young. The doctor offered what little comfort his science could provide. He prescribed boiled water to prevent dehydration and a weak tea made from willow bark to combat the fever. He warned them that the illness must run its course, and that the child's survival depended on his strength and on the will of God. He collected his modest fee, packed his leather bag, and prepared to depart, leaving behind a bottle of laudanum to help the infant rest. His diagnosis hung in the air after he was gone, a shroud of grim certainty. He had confirmed their fears, but in doing so, he had also offered them a narrative they could understand, a tragedy without a villain. The sickness was an act of nature, a cruel turn of fate, not the work of any human hand. It was this belief, this small and fragile comfort, that they clung to as the evening shadows lengthened, and the infant's condition continued to deteriorate. They now had an expert's confirmation, a seal of medical authority on their impending grief. The narrative of a natural, unavoidable death began to solidify, masking the far more disturbing truth that was unfolding before their eyes. It was in the wake of the doctor's departure, in the deepening twilight of the sick room, that Clara Mayfield made her move. She had been a ghost during the examination, a silent presence in the corner of the room, her face veiled by shadows, her stillness a stark contrast to the mother's trembling anxiety. Now, she stepped forward into the flickering candlelight. She approached the mother, her voice a low, steady murmur. She told her that on the plantation where she had been raised, her old mistress had taught her the uses of herbs. She spoke of a remedy for fevers of the gut, a poultice and a tea made from plants that grew in the dark, damp hollows of the Cove. Her words were offered as a gesture of help, a piece of old knowledge to supplement the doctor's modern medicine. The mother, her judgment clouded by exhaustion and despair, saw no reason to refuse. She was drowning, and she would grasp at any hand offered to her, no matter its origin. She gave Clara a weak, grateful nod, and the girl disappeared into the gathering dusk. Clara returned an hour later, her hands full of dark green leaves and slender, pale roots that still had clumps of black earth clinging to them. She worked at the hearth, her movements economical and precise. She crushed the leaves with a smooth stone, the grinding sound a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the infant's labored breathing. She steeped the roots in a small pot of boiling water, and a strange, sweetish, and slightly metallic aroma began to fill the cabin. It mingled with the other scents, the wood smoke and the sickness, creating a cloying, almost suffocating atmosphere. She prepared a small, lukewarm cup of the herbal tea, and with the mother's help, they managed to get a few spoonfuls of the dark liquid into the infant. Clara then took the crushed leaves, mixed them with a little cornmeal and water to form a paste, and spread it onto a piece of clean cloth. She instructed the mother to lay this poultice on the infant's swollen belly. These actions, on their surface, were those of a caregiver. She was applying a folk remedy, an act of compassion, yet there was an unsettling quality to her work. It felt less like healing and more like a ritual, her focus absolute, her expression unreadable. She was a priestess performing a rite whose meaning was known only to her, her duality on full display. She was both healer and destroyer, her hands offering a cure that was, in reality, the very instrument of the child's doom. That night, the infant's fever climbed to a terrifying peak. His small body was racked with tremors, and his cries weakened until they were little more than faint, breathy moans. The mother sat by the cradle, a vigil of unending horror. The heat in the cabin became unbearable, a physical weight that pressed down on her. The candle flames seemed to suck the very air from the room, their light casting long, distorted shadows that writhed on the walls like tormented spirits. Her mind, pushed to the brink, began to fracture. She slipped into a state between waking and sleeping, a fever dream of her own. In these hallucinatory visions, the world of the cabin became twisted and malevolent. The sweet, cloying scent of Clara's herbs intensified until it was a thick, suffocating perfume, the smell of wilting funeral flowers. She dreamed that she heard weeping, a child's mournful sobs, but the sound was not coming from the cradle. It seemed to be rising from beneath her feet, from the packed earth under the floorboards. In another vision, She saw the milk pitcher on the table begin to overflow, not with milk, but with a thick, white, sweet-smelling substance that coated the floor and rose around her ankles, cold and cloying. These were the whispers of the truth, her subconscious mind trying to assemble the pieces of a puzzle her conscious self refused to see. The sweet smell, the weeping from below, the poisoned milk. It was all there, just beyond the veil of her grief. The end came just before dawn, in the gray, liminal hour when the night has died but the day has not yet been born. The infant Samuel's breathing, which had been a constant ragged struggle, simply ceased. There was no final cry, no dramatic convulsion. There was only a shallow exhalation, a letting go, and then a silence that was more profound and more terrible than any sound. The fever broke, but it was the cold stillness of death that replaced it. For a long moment, the mother did not move. She sat staring at the small, still form in the cradle, unable to process the finality of what had happened. Then a sound escaped her, a low, guttural wail that was not human, but the pure, animal cry of a heart breaking. The patriarch, who had been sleeping fitfully in a chair by the hearth, was by her side in an instant. He knelt and wrapped his arms around her, his own body rigid with a grief he could not express in tears. The burial was a swift and brutal affair, dictated by the grim necessities of the time and place. In the oppressive summer heat, the dead could not be allowed to linger. The patriarch spent the morning building a small coffin from scrap lumber, the rhythmic rasp of the saw and the percussive blows of the hammer, a stark, practical measure of his sorrow. By midday, they carried the small wooden box to the family plot at the edge of the woods, a small clearing marked by a handful of rough stone markers. The patriarch dug the grave himself, his powerful shoulders straining as he tore into the rocky soil. The mother stood beside him, swaying slightly, a hollowed-out vessel of grief, her eyes fixed on the small box. There was no priest, no ceremony, only the raw, unadorned fact of their loss. They lowered the coffin into the earth, and the patriarch began to shovel the dark soil back into the hole. The sound of the dirt hitting the wooden lid was a sound of unbearable finality, each shovelful a punctuation mark at the end of their child's short life. They returned to a cabin that was now defined by an absence. The silence was immense, a living entity that filled the space once occupied by the infant's cries. The cradle in the corner was a monument to their loss, a silent, mocking testament to a future that had been stolen from them. They moved through the rest of the day in a fog of shock and sorrow, two solitary figures trapped in a shared, unspeakable pain. But as the sun began to set, casting long, mournful shadows across the floor, the mother noticed something that pricked through her numbness. Clara was not with them. She was not preparing the evening meal or tending to the fire. The mother looked around the small cabin, and then her gaze fell upon the nursery alcove. Clara was standing there, beside the empty cradle. She was not weeping. She was not praying. She was perfectly still, her back to the room, her head bowed as she stared down at the simple wooden crib. She lingered there for a long time, a statue of quiet contemplation. There was an intensity to her stillness that was deeply unsettling. She was not mourning the child. She seemed to be communing with the space he had left behind, her presence a silent, chilling question mark in the heart of their grief. The family had buried their son, and with him, they thought, the sickness that had taken him. They believed the fever had broken, but as Clara stood her strange vigil by the empty cradle, it was clear that the true sickness in that house had not yet even begun to reveal itself. The peace they sought in the small grave outside was a fragile illusion, soon to be shattered by the secrets that lay waiting, not in the earth, but just beneath the floorboards of their own home. The death of a child does not create a quiet house. It creates a vacuum, a void of sound that is heavier and more oppressive than any noise. In the days that followed the infant Samuel's burial, the McCready cabin was suffocated by this new silence. The familiar sounds of a home with a newborn, the soft cooing, the fussing cries, the gentle rock of the cradle, had all been violently excised. What remained was a stillness that was active and malevolent. It amplified every other sound to an unbearable degree: the scrape of a chair on the floor, the mournful sigh of the wind in the chimney, the relentless, judgmental ticking of the clock on the mantel. For the mother, Eliza, this silence was a constant torment. It was the sound of her failure, the sound of her emptiness. She moved through her chores in a daze, her body performing the familiar tasks of survival, while her mind remained trapped in the nursery alcove, fixed on the stark, accusing stillness of the empty crib. Grief had hollowed her out, leaving behind a fragile shell of a woman, her nerves scraped raw, her senses heightened to a state of painful acuity. The world had become a source of constant, low-grade terror. The patriarch, Thomas, retreated even further into the fortress of his own stoicism. His grief was a silent, corrosive thing that he refused to acknowledge or name. He threw himself into his work with a frantic energy, spending his days from sunup to sundown in the fields, his axe and his plow his only companions. He was a man at war with his own sorrow, attempting to beat it into submission through sheer physical exhaustion. He believed that to speak of the loss was to give it power, to allow it to take root in the home. He demanded a return to normalcy, a grim-faced march forward that ignored the gaping wound at the center of their lives. His pride, the unyielding bedrock of his character, would not allow him to be seen as a man broken by fate. He saw his wife's visible grief, not as a shared burden, but as a weakness, a dangerous indulgence in emotion that threatened the fragile order he was trying to reimpose on their shattered world. This house, his house, would not be a place of mourning. It would be a place of work, of survival. The dead were in the ground. The living had their duties. This was the cold, hard creed by which he intended to endure. It was the mother who heard it first. It began about a week after the burial, in the dead of night, that profound, ink-black silence between moonset and sunrise. She was lying awake, as she always was now, staring into the darkness, her mind replaying the final, agonizing hours of her son's life. At first, it was so faint that she thought it was a trick of her own mind, a phantom echo born of sleeplessness and sorrow. It was a sound that did not belong to the night. It was not the call of a night bird or the rustle of some small creature in the walls. It was a low, melodic humming. It was a human sound, soft and rhythmic, a simple, repetitive tune that rose and fell with the gentle cadence of a lullaby. Her blood ran cold. She lay perfectly still, her body rigid, every fiber of her being strained, listening. There it was again, a soft, crooning melody that seemed to be coming not from within the room, but from somewhere below. It was faint, distorted, as if she were hearing it through a thick layer of earth and wood. And then, with a jolt of recognition so visceral it made her gasp, she knew the tune. It was the same simple, haunting lullaby that Clara had sung to the infant Samuel in the days before he had fallen ill. The sound became a nightly ritual, a torment that began in the deepest hours of the night and faded with the first gray light of dawn. It was always the same, a soft, disembodied humming that seemed to emanate directly from the floorboards of the nursery alcove. The mother's nights became a waking nightmare of terrified listening. She would lie in her bed, her heart hammering against her ribs, tracking the faint, ghostly melody as it wove its way through the oppressive silence of the cabin. She told herself it was grief. She told herself that her mind, so ravaged by loss, was manufacturing phantoms to torture itself. How could it be real? Yet, the sound was so consistent, so undeniably present, that her rational explanations began to crumble, leaving her suspended in a state of pure, unadulterated fear. She said nothing to the patriarch. How could she? He, who had forbidden even the speaking of his son's name, would surely dismiss her fears as madness, as the hysterical ramblings of a grieving woman. Her terror was a solitary burden, a secret that isolated her even further within the claustrophobic confines of her own home. The second witness to the phenomenon was not human. The family kept a small hunting dog, a lean, intelligent animal of indeterminate breed, who was ordinarily of a calm and obedient temperament. A few nights after the humming began, the dog's behavior started to change. It grew restless and agitated, pacing the cabin floor at night, a low whine perpetually rumbling in its chest. Its attention became fixated on one particular spot, the floor directly in front of the empty cradle. The dog would approach the spot cautiously, its ears flat against its head, the fur along its spine raised. It would lower its snout to the gap between two floorboards and sniff intently, its body trembling. Then, it would begin to scratch. Not a tentative, idle scratching, but a frantic, desperate digging, its claws scrabbling uselessly against the thick poplar planks. The sound was jarring, a violent intrusion into the tense quiet of the night. The dog would dig until its paws were raw, its frantic whining escalating into sharp, distressed barks directed at the floor. The patriarch could not ignore this. It was a physical, tangible disruption. He was awoken one night by the dog's frantic scrabbling and rose from his bed in a silent fury. He strode over to the nursery alcove, grabbed the dog by the scruff of its neck, and dragged it outside, throwing it into the darkness. He returned to find his wife sitting up in bed, her face a pale mask of terror in the moonlight. She looked at him, her eyes pleading with him to acknowledge the strangeness, to offer some explanation, any explanation, other than the one that was screaming in her mind, but he would not. He saw the fear in her eyes, and it angered him. He saw it as a capitulation to the very forces of chaos he was trying to keep at bay. He stood over their bed, his voice a low, threatening whisper in the darkness. He told her that he would not have it. He would not have ghosts and spirits and foolish superstitions in his house. He stated that grief was a sickness of the mind, and it made people imagine things. He said the dog was simply reacting to her own nervousness, or perhaps there was a mouse under the floor. He forbade her from speaking of it again. He commanded her to be strong, to be silent, to put such thoughts out of her mind. His words were meant to be a comfort, an assertion of rational order over the encroaching darkness, but they were not. They were a wall, a final, brutal closing of the door on her terror, leaving her utterly alone with the humming that he refused to hear and the scratching he refused to understand. The mother's psychological state began to unravel. Trapped between a husband who denied her reality and a house that seemed to be whispering a terrible secret, her world became a landscape of fear. She began to watch Clara. The girl remained an enigma, a figure of placid efficiency, whose composure seemed to grow more profound as the atmosphere in the cabin grew more charged. She performed her duties with the same silent competence, her face revealing nothing. Yet the mother started to notice small, anomalous details in her behavior. She would find Clara standing motionless in the nursery, her gaze fixed on the floorboards, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on her lips. At other times, she would see the girl's lips moving, as if she were whispering to herself when she thought no one was watching. Clara's psyche, once a smooth, unreadable surface, was beginning to show cracks, revealing glimpses of the fractured, secret world that lay beneath. The breaking point came nearly a fortnight after the burial. The mother was once again lying awake, listening to the soft, incessant humming from the other room. The sound was clearer tonight, more defined. She could almost make out words within the melody, soft, sibilant whispers woven into the tune. A desperate, terrified curiosity finally overpowered her fear. She had to see. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet making no sound on the cold floor. The cabin was bathed in the pale, ethereal light of a full moon, which streamed through the small, unglazed windows, painting the room in shades of silver and black. She crept towards the nursery alcove, her heart a frantic, trapped bird in her chest. As she reached the edge of the alcove, she stopped, pressing herself flat against the log wall, and she saw Clara was there. She was not standing, but kneeling on the floor. Her body was hunched over, her head bowed so low that her hair brushed against the rough wooden planks. She was positioned directly over the spot where the dog had been scratching, her hands resting on the floor on either side of her head, as if in prayer or supplication, and she was whispering. Her voice was a soft, conspiratorial murmur, a stream of quiet, intimate words directed at the floorboards. She was not humming the lullaby now. She was speaking to something. She was having a conversation with an unseen, unheard participant that resided in the dark, cramped space beneath her. The mother could not make out the specific words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a tone of gentle reassurance, of comfort, the tone one would use to soothe a fretful child. The scene was one of utter, chilling madness. The moonlight cast Clara's kneeling form in a stark, theatrical relief. The dust motes dancing in the silver beams seemed to swarm around her, a congregation of silent, shimmering witnesses. The mother stood frozen, a silent scream trapped in her throat. This was not grief. This was not a phantom. This was real. This was a young woman, whispering lullabies and secrets to the empty, dark space beneath the floor where her son's presence once filled the room above. The sight was so profoundly wrong, so deeply horrifying, that the mother's mind recoiled. She backed away slowly, her movements stiff and robotic, and fled back to the perceived safety of her bed, where she lay shivering until morning. The image of the kneeling girl burned permanently into her memory. A few nights later, Clara Mayfield was gone. The mother and patriarch awoke to a cabin that felt strangely empty. Her small bundle of possessions had vanished from the corner where she slept. There was no note, no word of farewell. She had simply disappeared into the night, dissolving back into the wilderness from which she had come. For the patriarch, her flight was a confirmation of her untrustworthy nature and a welcome end to a period of unease. He assumed she had simply fled the bonds of her indenture, and he was glad to be rid of her. For the mother, Clara's disappearance brought a wave of profound, if temporary, relief. The source of the terror, the whispering, humming ghost in their home, was gone. That night, for the first time in weeks, the humming ceased. The silence that fell over the cabin was a clean, blessedly empty silence. A fragile, tentative peace began to settle over the household. They believed the haunting was over. They believed the house would finally rest. They were wrong. The true haunting had not even begun. It started 2 days after Clara's departure. It was a faint, almost unnoticeable smell, a slight sweetness in the air in the nursery alcove. The mother noticed it first, a cloying, sickly scent, like flowers left too long in a vase. She tried to air it out, but the odor clung to the room. Over the next day, it grew stronger, evolving from sweet to putrid. It was the smell of decay, of something organic and hidden, rotting slowly in the heat. The peace shattered. The terror returned, but this time it was not a sound, not a phantom. It was a physical presence, a stench that was rising up from beneath the floorboards, a foul and undeniable proof that something terrible had been left behind. The odor was a relentless, creeping invasion. It began as a whisper in the air and grew into a suffocating shroud that poisoned every corner of the cabin. It was a complex and layered stench, at once sickly sweet and profoundly foul, the unmistakable scent of decomposing flesh. It clung to their clothes, tainted their food, and worked its way into the very grain of the wooden walls. It was a physical manifestation of the corruption that had taken root in their home, an inescapable miasma of death. The mother, Eliza, tried to combat it with the meager weapons at her disposal. She burned bundles of sage and rosemary until the air was thick with a pungent, herbal smoke that only seemed to mingle with the rot, creating a new and even more grotesque perfume. She scrubbed the floorboards with lye soap and boiling water, the steam rising to scald her face, but the smell persisted, seeping up from below as if the earth itself were exhaling pestilence. The nursery alcove became the epicenter of the decay, a place of such concentrated foulness that they sealed it off, stuffing rags into the cracks around the simple wooden door. But the stench could not be contained. It seeped through the walls, a constant, nauseating reminder of the secret festering just beneath their feet. The patriarch, Thomas, endured the smell for 3 days. He was a man who believed in practical solutions to physical problems, but this was a problem he could not fight with his axe or his plow. The odor was an assault on his authority, a direct challenge to his mastery over his own domain. It was the final, unbearable culmination of weeks of strangeness, of his wife's perceived hysteria, of the disquieting presence of the departed girl. The humming, the dog's scratching, his wife's terror, he had dismissed them all as products of a grieving and unstable mind, but the stench was real. It was an undeniable physical fact that could not be ignored or wished away. It was proof that something was fundamentally wrong in his house. His anger, a slow-burning fire that had been simmering for weeks, finally reached its flashpoint. It was a rage born of helplessness, grief, and a profound sense of violation. He would tear the house apart if he had to. He would find the source of this corruption, and he would purge it with his own hands. His pride demanded it. On the morning of the 4th day, he took a crowbar from the small shed behind the cabin and strode into the nursery alcove. The mother watched him, her hand pressed to her mouth, a silent witness to this final desperate act of desecration. The air in the small room was so thick with the stench that it was almost liquid. Swarms of black flies, the same kind that had gathered by the cradle weeks before, rose in a buzzing, agitated cloud as he entered. They coated the walls, their humming a low, steady thrum of decay. The patriarch ignored them. His eyes were fixed on the floor, specifically on the section of boards in front of where the cradle had stood. With a guttural roar of exertion and fury, he jammed the tip of the crowbar into the thin gap between 2 planks. The wood groaned in protest, the sound of tearing fibers a sharp, violent shriek in the still morning air. He threw his entire weight onto the bar, his muscles straining, the veins standing out on his neck. With a final, splintering crack, the first board tore loose from the joists below, revealing a sliver of the dark, damp earth beneath. The release of the board unleashed a fresh wave of putrescence, a concentrated blast of rot so powerful that even the patriarch, a man accustomed to the smells of butchering and death, gagged and recoiled. He ripped the plank up and cast it aside, then set to work on the next, and the next. He worked with a grim, methodical savagery, his movements fueled by a rage that bordered on madness. The floorboards, once the solid foundation of his home, were being torn apart, revealing the secret, hidden space that had always existed just inches below their daily lives. The space beneath was not deep, perhaps a foot of clearance between the packed earth and the bottom of the joists. It was a dark, cramped world of cobwebs, damp soil, and the debris of construction. And it was here, in this forgotten crawl space, that the truth of the past weeks had been carefully, deliberately buried. The first discovery was innocuous, almost pathetically small. Lying on the dark earth, almost directly beneath the spot where the infant's head would have rested in his cradle, was a small, tightly wrapped bundle of cloth. The patriarch reached down into the darkness, his fingers closing around the object. It was made of a simple, coarse-spun linen, the color of oatmeal, now stained with damp and soil. He brought it up into the thin light filtering into the room. As he unwrapped the small parcel, his movements slowing, his rage giving way to a cold, dawning dread, he saw the faint, stitched markings on the corner of the fabric. A simple, neatly executed C.M., Clara Mayfield. His breath caught in his throat. Inside the cloth was a small glass vial, no bigger than his thumb. It was stoppered with a tiny cork, and it was completely empty. He held it up to the light. The glass was clear, unremarkable, but it felt in his hand like an object of immense and terrible significance. It was a vessel, a container, a piece of a puzzle whose shape was just beginning to resolve itself in his mind with horrifying clarity. He cast the vial aside as if it had burned him and turned his attention back to the exposed earth. His eyes, now adjusted to the gloom, began to pick out other shapes in the darkness, things that did not belong there. Lying a few feet from where he had found the vial were the small, skeletal remains of several animals. He could make out the delicate, bird-like bones of a squirrel, the larger frame of a rabbit, and what looked like a field mouse. They were arranged in a deliberate, almost ceremonial fashion, their small bodies desiccated and partially consumed by insects. They were not random casualties of nature. They had been placed there. They were offerings, sacrifices, the folk magic and superstitions of the slave quarters, which he had always dismissed with contempt, now seemed to rise up from the earth before him, a dark and potent reality he could no longer deny. This was not simply a hiding place, it was an altar. And then he saw the doll. It was nestled in the earth beside the animal bones, as if it were another body laid to rest. It was a crude thing, carved from a single piece of soft pine, its features little more than a few artless nicks in the wood. It wore a small dress fashioned from a scrap of the same linen as the bundle that had held the vial. It was a child's toy, a simple, handmade poppet. But there was a detail, a small, final touch of malevolent artistry that transformed it from a toy into an object of unspeakable horror. Its mouth, a simple carved slit in the wood, had been pried open and jammed into it. Wedged tightly between the wooden lips was a small, crudely fashioned cross made from two twigs tied together with a piece of twine. It was a symbol of salvation, of faith, twisted into an instrument of suffocation. It was a proxy, a stand-in, a symbolic representation of a child being silenced, its cries for help stopped by a perverted emblem of God. It was a confession, carved in wood and buried in the dirt. It screamed a truth that was more powerful and more damning than any spoken word. The patriarch stared at the doll, at the cross in its mouth, and the pieces of the last month clicked into place with the sickening finality of a cell door slamming shut. The humming lullabies, the whispers to the floor, the spoiled milk, the summer flux, Dr. Harrow's confident, rational diagnosis. It had all been a lie, a meticulous, patient, and diabolical deception. His son had not been taken by a fever. He had been murdered. He had been poisoned, slowly, deliberately, a little more each day, by the quiet, competent girl who had prepared his bottles. The patriarch fell to his knees, the crowbar slipping from his grasp and clattering onto the remaining floorboards. The stench of decay, the source of which was now horrifyingly obvious from the animal remains, was no longer just a smell. It was the scent of his own ignorance, the scent of his own failure to see the evil that had been living under his roof, sleeping by his hearth, and feeding his child from its hand. He had prided himself on his strength, his ability to protect his family from the dangers of the world, but the danger had not come from the wilderness or from a hostile neighbor. It had walked through his front door with a small bundle of possessions and a quiet, watchful face. It had served him his meals and cleaned his home, all while carrying out a sentence of death on his only son. The mother, Eliza, who had been watching in horrified silence from the doorway, finally moved. She stepped into the ruined nursery, her eyes wide with a terror that had now been given a name and a shape. As her husband knelt, broken, amidst the splintered wood and the rising stench of truth, her mind, in a flash of terrible, perfect recall, replayed a memory from the night Clara had disappeared. She had been woken by a small sound, the soft click of the cabin door closing. She had seen Clara's silhouette for a fleeting moment against the moonlit yard before she had vanished into the trees. And just before the door had closed, she had heard the girl whisper a single, parting phrase, not to her, but to the house itself, to the room where the child had died. The words had made no sense at the time, a nonsensical fragment from a dream, but now they returned to her with the force of a physical blow, their meaning stark and terrible. She remembered Clara's quiet, calm voice, a voice devoid of malice or triumph, a simple statement of fact. She had whispered it to the ghosts in the room, a final, chilling epitaph for the crime she had committed. The mother heard the words again in her mind, as clearly as if they were being spoken at that very moment. The milk's too sweet. It had not been a complaint. It had been a confession. The discovery beneath the floorboards shattered the insular world of the McCready cabin, allowing the raw, unfiltered horror of the truth to flood in. For the patriarch, Thomas, the confrontation with the unthinkable artifacts buried in his home was a complete undoing of his sense of self. The rage that had fueled him to tear up the floor evaporated, leaving behind the cold, heavy ash of guilt. The doll with the cross in its mouth was a totem of his own blindness, a brutal effigy of his failure as a father and a protector. The days that followed were a blur of suffocating silence and unspoken accusations. He and the mother, Eliza, moved around each other like ghosts, the shared knowledge of what had truly happened to their son, a chasm between them that was too wide and too deep to cross. The cabin, once a symbol of his self-reliance, was now a crime scene, every shadow and creak of the floorboards, a tormenting echo of the deception that had been so meticulously orchestrated within its walls. His pride lay in splinters on the nursery floor, and in its place, a gnawing, corrosive shame began to eat away at his soul. He had not just lost a son, he had been a willing, ignorant accomplice to his murder. For the mother, Eliza, the recollection of Clara's final whispered words, "The milk's too sweet," was a key turning in a lock, opening a door in her mind to a chamber of horrors she had not known existed. Every memory of the past weeks was now refracted through this new, terrifying lens. She replayed every interaction with Clara, every moment of the girl's quiet, unnerving competence. The preparation of the bottles, the brewing of the herbal tea, the calm, placid expression on the girl's face as she had watched the infant Samuel wither and die. It was no longer the face of a caregiver, it was the face of an executioner. The duality that had once been so unsettling now revealed itself as a monstrous, calculated performance. The guilt she felt was of a different, more insidious kind than her husband's. She had been the one to accept Clara's help, to allow her to administer the herbal remedies, to trust the hand that was methodically poisoning her child. The mother's intuition, The dreams of sweet smells and weeping from beneath the floor had been the truth trying to claw its way to the surface, and she had suppressed it. She had chosen the comforting lie of a natural illness over the unthinkable, monstrous truth. Her guilt was the guilt of a sentry who had fallen asleep at her post, only to awaken and find that the enemy had not only breached the walls but had been invited in and given a seat by the fire. The investigation, if it could be called that, began not with a sheriff or a magistrate, but with the quiet, desperate need for understanding. The patriarch, driven by a need to comprehend the origins of the evil that had destroyed his family, broke his self-imposed isolation and rode out into the Cove. He did not speak of the vial or the doll. He began to ask questions, careful, guarded questions, about the girl, Clara Mayfield. He spoke to the neighbor who had first brought her to their farm, to the families who lived on the other side of the valley, to the storekeeper who saw everyone who passed along the single, rutted road. He presented his inquiries as a matter of simple curiosity about the girl who had fled his service, but the people of the Cove were adept at reading the silences between words. They saw the hollowed-out look in his eyes, the new, deep lines of grief etched into his face, and they knew this was about more than a runaway servant. Slowly, reluctantly, a history began to emerge, pieced together from half-remembered gossip, old rumors, and the collective, unwritten memory of the community. The name Mayfield, they told him, carried with it a dark legacy in this part of the mountains. They spoke of Clara's mother. Her name was never spoken. She was referred to only as the Mayfield woman. She had been the property of a wealthy plantation owner in the foothills, a man known for his cruelty and his appetites. Years ago, before the war, there had been a scandal. The plantation master had died suddenly, violently, his body contorted in agony, his death attributed to a sudden, virulent colic. But whispers had followed the death, whispers of a slave woman who knew the secrets of the earth, who knew which roots could kill and which could cure. An investigation, a brutal and cursory affair, had been conducted. The Mayfield woman had been accused, tried, and executed for the crime of poisoning her master. Her guilt was a foregone conclusion, her death a swift and brutal reassertion of the established order. The locals spoke of this history in hushed, fearful tones, as if the telling of it might conjure the same darkness into their own homes. They told the patriarch that Clara was the woman's only surviving child. After her mother's execution, she had become a ward of the plantation, a living symbol of her mother's sin, passed from one owner to another, an object tainted by her lineage. This was the curse she carried, the inheritance of a violence that had been done to her family and a violence that had been done by it. The patriarch listened to these stories, and the portrait of Clara began to shift. She was no longer just a malevolent individual. She was the product of a history, the final link in a chain of cruelty and retribution that stretched back years. He learned that her mother had been executed not just for the act of poisoning, but for the transgression of wielding a secret, powerful knowledge that terrified the men who sought to control her. Clara had not just inherited her mother's name, she had inherited her legacy. The question of whether she was cursed by this inheritance or if she herself was the curse, returned to claim a debt of blood, began to haunt him. The final, devastating piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. A circuit-riding preacher, a man who traveled a vast, rugged territory of mountain congregations, heard the whispers of the patriarch's inquiries. He sought the man out, finding him at the edge of his now blighted fields. The preacher carried with him a small, worn leather satchel containing letters and records from the churches he served. He told the patriarch that he remembered the Mayfield woman's case, and he had in his possession letters from the time, written between the plantation owner and other prominent families in the region. With a heavy heart, The preacher shared a detail that had been buried in the dry, legalistic language of these old correspondences. The Macready family, it turned out, was not unconnected to this dark history. The patriarch's own father had owed a significant debt to the poison plantation master. In the years following the master's death, as his estate was settled, that debt had been a point of contention. The letters hinted that the transfer of Clara Mayfield to the Macready family was not a simple arrangement for hired help. It was the final settling of that old debt. They had not purchased a servant. They had accepted a human payment, an act of atonement, as one letter phrased it, for the financial sins of the previous generation. Clara had been sent to their home not as a blank slate, but as a living embodiment of a long and bitter history between the two families. She was a ghost from a past the patriarch had not even known he was a part of, sent to exact a price for a crime he had not committed, but from which his family had, in some small way, benefited. While the patriarch was unearthing the history of Clara's life, the mother, Eliza, felt compelled to seek a different kind of truth. She could not rest with the knowledge of what was buried beneath her home. She sent a message, a desperate plea, to Dr. Ellis Harrow. She told him only that new information had come to light concerning her son's death, and that his presence was urgently required. The doctor, his professional curiosity piqued and perhaps carrying a measure of his own guilt over the child's death, made the arduous journey back to the Cove. The mother met him at the door and led him, in silence, to the desecrated nursery. The stench of decay still hung in the air, a foul testament to the secrets it had held. She showed him the empty vial, the ceremonial arrangement of animal bones, and the crude doll with the cross in its mouth. She told him of Clara's final, whispered words. Dr. Harrow, the man of science and reason, looked upon the scene with a horror that was both clinical and profound. His face, usually a mask of professional detachment, became pale and drawn. He had seen death in all its forms, on the battlefield and in the sick room, but this was something else entirely. This was a violation of the natural order, a perversion of the sacred trust between caregiver and child. His rational mind reeled, trying to process the evidence before him. The summer flux, his confident diagnosis, had been a lie, a carefully constructed illusion that had been fed to him, and which he had, in his professional arrogance, accepted without question. He felt a surge of cold, intellectual fury at having been so completely deceived. He took the vial from the mother and examined it, his trained eye searching for any residue. He then went to the small cupboard where the infant's things were kept. He found a bottle that had not been washed, a thin, white film of dried milk still clinging to the inside. He also took a sample of the soil from beneath the floorboards, scraping it into a small tin. He worked for the rest of the day at the cabin's simple table, a makeshift laboratory in the heart of the crime scene. He used a small set of chemical reagents he carried in his bag, performing a series of simple, colorimetric tests. He boiled, he filtered, he observed. As the afternoon sun slanted through the dusty windows, he found what he was looking for. The residue from the milk bottle, when treated with his chemicals, produced a faint but unmistakable greenish precipitate. The soil sample did the same. It was arsenic, a common, easily obtainable poison, often used to kill rats and other pests. It was a poison that, when administered in small, successive doses, mimicked the symptoms of a severe gastrointestinal illness almost perfectly. The fever, the vomiting, the intestinal distress. It was all a classic presentation of arsenic poisoning. He had been looking for a disease, so that is what he had seen. He had failed to consider the possibility of malice, the community's complicity, their willingness to believe in a natural death, had created the perfect environment for the crime to go undetected. That night, Under the flickering light of a single candle, Dr. Harrow sat down to write his final report. He was a man of the law, a man who believed in the formal processes of justice. He began to document his findings with meticulous, forensic precision. He described the exhumation of the evidence, the chemical analysis, the conclusion of murder by poison. He named Clara Mayfield as the perpetrator. He was creating the official record, the document that would transform this family tragedy into a legal case, the story that would be told and remembered. But as he wrote, a profound sense of unease settled over him. What justice could be found here? Clara was gone, vanished into the vast, unsearchable wilderness of the mountains. A warrant would be useless. And what of the Macreadys? What would this official record do for them but permanently affix the stain of this horror to their name? He thought of the valley, of the long history of violence and cruelty that had led to this moment. Clara's act was not a singular, inexplicable evil. It was a response, a dark and twisted echo of a crime that had been committed against her mother years before. Was she a monster, or was she simply the final, bloody chapter in a story that others had written? Just before dawn, as the first, faint light began to touch the high peaks of the mountains, Dr. Harrow made a decision. He took the pages of his meticulously written report, the official, factual account of the murder of Samuel Macready, and he held them to the flame of the candle. He watched as the paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash, the words of truth dissolving into smoke and disappearing into the rafters. In that moment, he became a part of the story, a conspirator in the silence. He chose to let the truth die with him. He would not allow the formal, clumsy machinery of the law to grind this family and this valley's dark history into a public spectacle. His silence was a form of mercy, and perhaps a form of justice in itself. He ensured that the story of the girl who sweetened the milk with poison would not survive in any official record. It would be preserved only in rumor, in whispered stories told around the fire on long winter nights, a piece of local folklore, its terrible, factual core slowly eroding over time until it was little more than a ghost story. The truth, he believed, would be buried again, this time under the weight of his own silence. But some truths, like bodies, have a way of refusing to stay in the ground. The ashes of Dr. Harrow's report settled into the dust of the Macready cabin, and with them, the official truth of Samuel Macready's death was erased. The story, untethered from the anchor of a formal record, began its slow, inexorable drift into the realm of myth. The patriarch and the mother lived out the remainder of their days in the cabin, two solitary figures imprisoned by a shared, unspeakable memory. They became a feature of the Cove's landscape, like an old, lightning-scarred tree, a living testament to a sorrow so profound it had become a part of their very being. They never spoke of their son, nor of the girl who had served them for a single, devastating summer. The nursery alcove was sealed, the floorboards replaced, the space itself exorcised from the geography of their home, but the absence remained, a phantom limb that ached with a pain that time could not dull. When they died, years later, within months of each other, they were buried in the small family plot beside the tiny, unmarked grave of their infant son. The story, it seemed, was buried with them, left to the whispers and the encroaching wilderness. Time in Cades Cove moves differently than in the world outside. Decades bleed into one another, seasons turn, and the works of humanity are slowly, patiently reclaimed by the forest. The Macready cabin, abandoned, began its long, slow process of decay. The roof sagged, the chinking crumbled from between the logs, and the fields the patriarch had so fiercely carved from the wilderness were gradually reconquered by brambles and poplars. It became a place of local legend, a haunted house on the edge of the woods that children dared each other to approach but never to enter. The story of the family who had lived there became simplified, its sharp, horrifying details worn smooth by countless retellings, until it was just a vague tale of sadness, of a child lost to sickness, of a home that had never known peace. The specific evil that had transpired within its walls was forgotten, the memory of it as decomposed as the bodies in the nearby soil. The artifacts of the crime, the doll and the animal bones, lay undisturbed in the earth beneath the floor, their story waiting in the darkness. Nearly a century passed. The world changed in ways the original inhabitants of the Cove could never have imagined. The isolated valley was transformed, absorbed into a national park, a place of preserved history for tourists to gaze upon. In the 1960s, a project was undertaken to restore some of the original homesteads, to salvage them from the relentless pull of nature and time. The McCready cabin, dilapidated but still standing, was one of those chosen for preservation. A team of historical renovators arrived, their task to stabilize the structure and restore it to something resembling its original state. They were practical men, carpenters and laborers, not historians or archaeologists. They saw the cabin not as a repository of secrets, but as a collection of failing timbers and rotten floorboards. It was during the process of replacing the nursery floor that the discovery was made, a century-delayed echo of the patriarch's own furious excavation. As a young workman pried up the old, termite-eaten poplar planks, his crowbar struck something solid in the crawl space below. Assuming it was a rock, he reached into the dark, cool earth, his fingers closing around a small wooden object. He pulled it out into the bright afternoon sunlight. It was a child's toy chest, a simple, crudely made box of pine, its small iron hinges rusted almost completely through. It was not a grand or valuable object, but its presence there was an anomaly. With a grunt of effort, he broke the rusted latch and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of what had once been dried leaves and was now little more than black dust, lay a single, small glass vial, stoppered with a cork. The vial was empty, but its careful placement within the chest, this deliberate act of preservation, spoke volumes. It was not a piece of trash that had been discarded. It had been saved. It was a relic, an artifact, a piece of a story that someone, long ago, had not wanted to be entirely forgotten. Perhaps the mother, Eliza, in a final, secret act of remembrance, had placed it there before the floor was sealed, a tangible piece of evidence against the silence that had consumed her life. The vial, a vessel of confession, had resurfaced, a message in a bottle washed ashore after 100 years. The discovery of the chest and the vial, though noted in the restoration team's logbook, was treated as little more than a curious footnote, a small, inexplicable piece of the cabin's past. It was an artifact without a story, and so it was cataloged and stored away in a dusty archive, its terrible significance unknown. But the story had not died completely. Like a hardy mountain root, it had found a way to survive, not in written records, but in the living memory of a family. The tale of the sweet milk had been passed down through the generations of the extended McCready clan, a strange and cautionary family lullaby. It had survived as a grandmother's story, a piece of oral history whispered to children, its meaning and origins lost to time. It was a surviving McCready descendant, an elderly woman living in a nearby town, who heard of the discovery at the old cabin and provided the final, chilling piece of the puzzle. She was a historical researcher's primary source, a direct link to the events of 1870. She remembered her own grandmother, a woman who had been a small child when the infant Samuel had died, singing a particular lullaby. It was a haunting, simple melody, and she could still recall the tune perfectly. The researcher played for her a recording of a traditional Appalachian lullaby, one whose melody matched the descriptions from the historical account. The old woman's eyes widened in recognition. She confirmed it was the same song. She then recalled that her grandmother would sometimes end the lullaby with a strange, nonsensical phrase, words that the children in the family had always treated as a part of the song. After the final, gentle notes of the lullaby had faded, her grandmother would whisper, as if sharing a secret with the child she was putting to sleep. "The milk's too sweet." The phrase had been preserved, perfectly intact, for a century. It had been passed down not as a confession of murder, but as a lyric, its horrifying context stripped away, leaving only the strange, poetic resonance of the words themselves. The lullaby Clara had sung to her victim had become, through the strange alchemy of family memory, a Macready family heirloom. And so we are left here, at the end of the record, with these fragmented pieces of a forgotten tragedy. We have the vial, a physical object that proves a secret was kept. We have the story, a ghost that has haunted a family's memory for 100 years. And we have the central, unanswerable question: what was in Clara Mayfield's heart? Was her act one of pure, sociopathic evil, a cold and calculated destruction of an innocent life? Or was it something more complex? Was it an act of vengeance, a terrible and twisted form of justice for the murder of her own mother, the infant Samuel a proxy for the system that had destroyed her family? Or was it, perhaps, a dark and horrifying act of mercy? Did she see in the infant Samuel another life destined for the cruelty and suffering of the world she knew? And did she believe that a swift, sweet death in the cradle was a kinder fate than a long life of pain? We cannot know. The truth is buried with her, in whatever unmarked grave she eventually found in the vast wilderness. What we do know is that evil can be patient. It can wear the mask of servitude, of care, of kindness. It can ferment in the quietest corners of a home, in the most intimate acts of nourishment. It can be preserved, like a poison in a bottle, in the artifacts and memories that are left behind. The soil of Cades Cove is rich with such stories, with the whispers of things that were meant to be forgotten but refused to die. The quiet beauty of the valley is a lie, a green and tranquil mask that conceals a history of violence and sorrow. The lullaby, a melody meant to bring peace and sleep, can be heard faintly now, a final, ghostly echo under these closing words. It is a reminder that the past is never truly past. It is always there, just beneath the floorboards, waiting for someone to pry them up and listen to the secrets that are rising from the dark and silent earth. Was the infant Samuel's death an act of revenge, or was he simply another offering to history's endless, insatiable rot? The record is silent. The case file on Clara Mayfield is now closed. Subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive to stand among those present when the next is opened, and leave your thoughts on what you have witnessed.